All right, I think we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome into Ready, Set, Respond. We have another great episode for you today. We are here to talk all about the real reasons that residents leave. I'm Carla Alisea. I'm the Director of Research and Performance for Satisfaction Apartment Ratings, and I'm just so thrilled to be able to host these webinars to really talk about the things that matter to our operations, to our resident satisfaction, to our bottom line, to our job satisfaction. And I have a fabulous guest here today joining us. I've got Sara Graham on the call. Welcome in, Sara.
Thank you.
Sara is someone I've been following for most of my career. She used to be the Senior Vice President of Marketing at Beacon Communities and then the head of marketing at Dolben. And I just used to take a lot of my inspiration from the initiatives that she was pushing out. And so having her on the call today is such a true pleasure for me. And as I said, I am bringing in executives turn consultants, industry leaders and movers and shakers who are now out there sharing their secrets, spilling the tea. And Sara recently did a post on LinkedIn all about the real reasons that residents leave. And here at Satisfax, that just resonates with us because that's all about the data that we're collecting, helping operators connect with those residents. So I brought her on. We're going to have a conversation about those real reasons residents leave. Now, we do throughout the program poll our audience. So you'll see that QR code on your screen. If you go ahead and give that a scan, get logged in, you can give us some reactions on there. I see some hearts coming. Thanks so much for that. I know that was for Sara. So yes, exactly. So be ready for those poll questions. But let's just dive right in, shall we, Sara?
Love to.
Let's do it. All right. So in that post, you said that we often blame rent, right, for the real reason that we get non-renewals. But in your experience, that's just not the case. So can you walk us through what you mean by rent's not always to blame and what you think operators should be doing to reframe the retention conversation?
Yes, for sure. This is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart, having spent more than 2 decades on the operator side as a marketer before I went out on my own as a consultant and fractional CMO. And so rent is the headline reason that people give when they move out, but it's really not the full story. It's the easy answer. And when residents say it's too expensive, what they're really saying is, I don't feel like I'm getting what I'm paying for. And the decision to renew is not a single moment. It is not something that people just wake up, having made a decision overnight. It is the culmination of months of experiences. Some are great, some are frustrating, and some of those experiences are where expectations just go quietly unmet. Maybe it's a work order that took too long or a recurring noise issue that just wasn't addressed. Over time, those small moments just add up. And when the renewal notice arrives, especially if it may be coupled with a rent increase, residents start to weigh the value. And so the shift, or sort of the opportunity here, is to reframe retention as a daily value equation. It's not a one-time event. It is the resident's perception over time, day by day, of all of those tiny moments. And we as operators, as marketers, as on-site teams, we all work together collectively to shape that. And so instead of asking, how do we prevent the move out, the real question, the better question is, where is value potentially eroding throughout that journey?
Yeah, that's That's definitely what our data speaks to as
Sure.
well, right? It's how do we identify those little frictions,
Mm.
right? So let's talk about friction in that experience, that renter experience, those day-to-day moments that may be eroding that value. What are some of the most common friction points that operators sometimes overlook in your experience?
Friction is sneaky. It's not generally one big blow up. It's all of these tiny things that wear people down. We've all seen them and heard them, and but a resident submits a work order and there's no update, or there's no follow up, or they get bounced between a resident app and a website, and then phone calls and maybe chats just to get basic support. Um, I think the other big one that comes to mind for me is renewal notices. Sometimes those just show up as these cold, impersonal emails, and it feels more like a bill than a relationship. That's another big miss. In the context of rising rents, that kind of stuff tips the scales, where you've got friction and the financial pressure, and that just pushes people to move out. But I think one thing that I really want to drive home here, and I touched on this in the post, is that, or the post that we made on LinkedIn, which I think is how we sort of got started to talk about all this anyway, is that renters don't just compare your property to the place across the street. They are comparing properties, apartment communities, to experiences like Amazon and Netflix and Spotify and Uber and Apple. And that looks like seamless service and proactive communication and super intuitive systems. And when those things sort of unravel in their apartment living experience, they do start to ask, why am I paying as much as I am for this level of service? And the big thing here is that friction, those tiny little moments we've been talking about, they're not always visible. Those moments of frictions are not always visible in a dashboard.
Yeah.
That stuff lives in the daily grind. And if you are not listening to your teams, if you are working at a corporate level, or a regional level, if you're not listening to your teams, or if you're not tuning into resident sentiment, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, there are some key warning signs that you're probably missing.
Okay. All right. Well, let's find out what our audience thinks about friction. So, what do you believe creates the most friction on the path to renewal? I have a couple of options. I know they're not the only ones, but out of the options, which one do you think is causing the most friction maybe for your residents right now? Is it delayed maintenance with no follow-up, inconsistent or impersonal communication, jumping between apps to pay rent or to get help or to submit a work order, or that big renewal increase and absolutely no explanation, or as you say, very impersonal invitation? So what are you guys experiencing out there?
I'm loving watching these bars move as we here. I'm like, okay, friends, let's bring on the votes.
Yes. Well, and it really helps us as having this conversation as a host and as a guest speaker to connect with what our audience is feeling, right? And validate some of our talking points as well. If we're up here saying, friction is because of delayed maintenance, and no one's saying there's delayed maintenance, then maybe there's that disconnect, which we're going to talk about a little bit. So I really like seeing what our audience is experiencing. I see that the app issue doesn't seem to be resonating right now with our audience, but I'll tell you a little story. In operations that I was always concerned about is the number of apps or websites or technology, not only that we were putting in front of our residents, but what we're also putting in front of our teams. Yeah. So let's move on. Thanks, guys, for giving us that information. Let's talk a little bit about that perceived value. So where do you think most operators unintentionally undermine value, even if it's, rent's competitive and the product's really good? Where are those, unintentional undermining value propositions happening in operations.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is really where the rubber meets the road. It's not about your granite countertops or your sparkling swimming pools or any of the perks that so many apartment communities offer. It is really about the experience and what does that look and feel like on a daily basis. And even the most amazing apartment loses its luster if maintenance is slow. We just saw on the poll that you just ran, maintenance, I think, came out on top. It was close.
Yeah.
But that was a really big one. And if every interaction feels transactional, or if the resident portal is confusing, that seemed to rank a little lower in the real-time poll. But those little things really do stack up. And if residents are constantly asking themselves, does this feel right? Am I getting what I'm quote unquote paying for? And if the answer starts to shift towards no, then even that modest rent bump can feel like a deal breaker. And so the undermining of value comes even unintentionally when the communication is spotty, when the tech is rolled out without training. You just touched on that a minute ago. It's a huge issue. I know in companies that I was part of, and now as an independent consultant, that is a big thing where teams are saying, please, no more tech. We've got to push pause and really think about how are the teams on site being supported with the workflows, because that does trickle into the resident experience. And if it feels too transactional, if it feels disjointed, if it feels discombobulated, that makes residents feel like they're not valued, or like they're a line item in a spreadsheet. And I think, the good news is operators don't need to discount rent to improve value. The biggest lift can come from removing the friction, improving the flow. Sometimes that means simplifying your tech stack, not adding more, and showing up as humans. The human aspect, there's this whole, is AI coming to take jobs? The real answer is AI will probably help you do your job better, but the human touch still matters so much.
Absolutely. I love that. And I love that you brought that into this conversation because, we talk about it a lot at Satisfax when we're doing our trainings, when we're looking at data. We talk about sense of community. In fact, this is a really good segue to talk about our drivers. So let me pull that up here. If you're a follower of Satisfax, you know that every year we put out our correlation analysis. This is based off of our annual surveys that we do. And so last year we did roughly a little over 18,000 surveys, annual surveys. And we do a correlation analysis to see what are the top 5 drivers for things like perception of value, which we're talking about, likelihood to renew, likelihood to recommend, and sense of community, because these 4 elements have such a big relationship with our operations, with resident satisfaction, with positive business outcomes, right? And so every year we put them out. These are the most recent, and you could see sense of community, which is that relationship between the resident and the team, the management team. Not so much, it's not about, do I like my neighbors? Do I like my neighborhood? It's more about the relationship that our teams are having with our residents. And you can see sense of community is the number 1 driver for perception of value. I don't see that changing. It's been that way for quite some time. And I just don't see that changing just because AI is here. In fact, I'm seeing more and more people sharing stories about how they can't get a hold of the team because the AI won't transfer their phone call. And we got to be really careful about that, right? I also wanted to point out, I actually got to do the correlation analysis this year on our data. So I was able to see the negative relationship. So the number 1 negative relationship across all of these drivers was existing problems. So what that means is if the resident sitting at home with a problem And I always like to think of them on their couch, scratching their heads. Like, what is management doing? Because this problem hasn't been solved. And I'm scratching my head because I have no idea. There's no communication. I'm not in the loop. I'm not in the know. So that's my visuals. If your residents are sitting on their couches, scratching their head, wondering what you're doing with an existing problem, that has the highest negative relationship to all four of these drivers: value, likelihood to renew, likelihood to recommend, and sense of community. Now, just putting it out there, correlation is not causation. There's a relationship between these things. If we want to find out what is causing that outcome, we have to do a bit more experimentation. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about how do we, as a company, we have these different departments, they all have their objectives. How do we work together? Because in an ideal world, you have a marketing department or a resident experience or employee experience department setting a standard, setting a brand, and you have an operation teams that are supposed to deliver. So, Sarah, what happens when those departments are not in sync?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is residents feel it. Marketing paves the way, right? You put all of this money and effort into driving traffic to a community. And if the experience doesn't line up with the expectation, that gets pretty rocky quickly. Marketing might promote 24-hour maintenance, right? But if the ops team is understaffed or under-resourced, that promise quickly can turn into a complaint. And that shows up in reviews often. It says, something like, oh, this place looks amazing online, but living here has been a disaster. And that is not just a PR issue. That is a trust issue. I think there's a lot of value in thinking about regular cross-functional sync-ups. And so to actually be able to shut down the silos and say, what are we promoting right now? What are we actually delivering? What are the residents saying? And what is the data telling us? And data can come from lots of different places, but those sort of four pieces, going through that framework in a sync up really does make a difference. And when those conversations happen consistently, you can get ahead of any potential misalignment before it affects the bottom line. And the data sharing is really important here. So think about maintenance metrics, sentiment scores, your leasing trends, all of that shared context really does lead to smarter decisions. And those ongoing conversations are so important, because if you don't have visibility across an organization, whatever that may look like in your organization, if you don't have visibility, there are blind spots. Yeah. They're avoidable, but the blind spots are there if you're not thinking intentionally about those conversations and really being able to connect some dots.
Yeah. I'm going to go there. So in operations, growing up in multifamily, there's so much emphasis on our financials, right? There are dashboards, there are budgets, there are meetings around the dollars and cents. Operators that are really moving the needle in experience, they have those same type of dashboards, right? Those business intelligence dashboards with KPIs that they're monitoring that aren't necessarily about dollars and cents. They impact the dollars and cents.
Absolutely.
Right? But they're not tracking dollars and cents. They're tracking, how work time to complete a work order, resident satisfaction metrics, internal feedback, and they're getting very creative business intelligence dashboards, OKRs, objectives and key results, right? KPI dashboards, so that there are very transparent ways to identify, those warning signs and get ahead of them. Absolutely. Okay, so audience, another question for you. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between your marketing and your operations in your organization? Is it marketing sets expectations that ops just can't deliver? Is it ops isn't aware of the current marketing messages? Is there little to no visibility into maybe leasing or performance data, as we were just talking? Is there no data sharing around those KPIs? Are we aligned and we regularly collaborate? Do we feel really good there? Or you're just not sure? I'm in one department and I don't see the other side. What are you experiencing out there in operations and marketing right now? All right, we see that coming in. And again, a little bit of everything. Although we're seeing a clear opportunity here between setting realistic expectations. I think that's a big one right there, is setting realistic expectations from the marketing department. I know I myself have been guilty of setting some unrealistic expectations. And again, breaking down those silos, I think, having those meetings. Have you seen in organizations, in your experience, either in operations or as a consultant, Sara, some good examples of how to break those silos down?
Yeah, I mean, besides the meeting regularly piece, I think one really low-hanging fruit, a piece of low-hanging fruit, is if you work on site or in a regional capacity, really looking at what's on your website and making sure that the features, the amenities, the things that are on there, that those align with the feedback that you receive during tours, the things that your teams really emphasize when you're talking with residents, when you're talking with prospects, and then making sure your marketing team, whatever that may look like, gets that feedback. I mean, marketing is not meant to be this, top down, some corporate team somewhere that's
we like to think we are, though, don't we?
There's so much value, and again, sort of knocking down the silos, and the feedback comes from everywhere. And marketing, I promise you, as a marketing leader who worked in this space for many, many years, I promise you, your marketing team wants to know what really resonates, because if your marketing teams can't get on site as often as they would like, making sure that conversation is happening is so important. And marketers will tell you that we need to think about SEO, and the copy on your website, it needs to be lined up in a certain way. And that is true. I'm not discounting that work, but there's a synergy and there's a partnership between marketing teams and on-site teams to make sure that what's on your website really does represent the property to its absolute best.
Yeah.
And be realistic, but that there is this partnership that needs to happen for that to succeed. So speaking as a longtime marketing leader, I will tell you that it's kind of the magical pixie dust that really helps properties soar.
I love that, magical pixie dust.
We could all use some pixie dust, right?
Yes. So you said that retention is just not a corporate strategy. It's won and lost through these daily interactions. So what do you think operators tend to overlook when it comes to supporting our frontline teams in that mission?
Yeah. So kind of back to what we were saying about the on-site teams, retention does not live in a spreadsheet. It does not live in a dashboard. It is not a KPI per se. It lives in how teams show up every day. The frontline teams, the on-site teams, are the ones who are delivering the experience. They're welcoming the new residents. They are calming the frustrations. They're managing service requests. They are putting out these daily fires day in and day out. And often what happens is, teams are just expected to sometimes deliver excellence without tools, training, or sometimes autonomy to do that. And so sometimes that shows up as operators are launching systems without explaining the why. The intention is always there, right? But sometimes the why, the explanation of the why gets glossed over. Or we think as corporate resources that we think we explain the why, but it's really not clear. Or sometimes more tech is piled on. I said this a few minutes ago, where there is more tech that's piled on without removing outdated processes or outdated tech. And that just leads to frustration and burnout and ultimately poor adoption. So I think that the companies that are really winning in this regard treat on-site teams like experienced designers, not just a task manager. And so that means investing in onboarding and upskilling and giving space for feedback and improvement. Again, going back to what we talked about a moment ago, making sure there's a feedback loop on all sides, that it's not a one-way feedback loop. That's not a loop. It's a tunnel. And we don't like feedback tunnels. We like the loops. And really trusting on-site teams to make resident-centric or resident-focused decisions. I think the big piece, or like the take home here, is empowered teams create empowered residents. Empowered residents are happy residents.
Yes. Policy and procedures are important, but only when you're given empowerment.
Yes.
Or else the experience for the resident is the on-site team is just dictating what can and can't be done. There's no empowerment there, and it can come off as impersonal and transactive, right? Instead of a lived experience. Let's talk about feedback loops. And I loved how you said loops, not tunnels. I'm going to use that. Love that. But here at Satisfax, that's what we do. We love a feedback loop, right? So let's talk about the difference between an internal feedback loop, those internal systems and surveys, and then those public feedback loops, public reviews, ratings online. They both give us feedback, but they're very different purposes, right? So what should operators be doing with each, and how should those strategies differ?
Yeah, great question. All of it is valuable. I think of internal surveys as your early warning system. They help you catch issues before they show up in public reviews, right? Sort of the flag to say, hey, we've got something here. But they really only work, they're only valuable, maybe is a good way to say this, if you're using them well, meaning they are short, they are targeted, and they are followed by action. The worst thing is getting feedback and then not doing anything with it. And I think the flip side is a public review is your performance report card. It's out there for all to see, and they reflect the resident's experience in real time. If the move-in is rocky, that's what they're going to talk about, even if maybe their renewal went really smoothly later. And you're right, Carla, like both forms of feedback are gold, but the action is really the key piece. And I know that it's hard sometimes to not take feedback personally, but it's really important to remember that feedback is not necessarily a criticism, it's an insight. And there's a really fine line to walk that, or that's a fine line to walk in that, it's an opportunity, and we have opportunities every day in every part of our lives, personally, professionally, all the parts, to say, okay, it's insight, and what do I do with that? And I think the big piece of this, again, goes back to trust. So when a resident knows that their voice was heard and acted on, so closing that loop, that builds the trust. And trust is the opposite of friction. Trust is driving retention instead of taking away from it.
And when you put it that way, it got me thinking. Same for the relationship between the on-site team and the corporate operations, right? So if you're gathering that feedback, and as a corporate operator, maybe you're a regional trainer, a regional manager, an overseer of on-site teams, using that feedback to have a growth mentality,
Yes.
not a punitive mentality. How can we use this feedback to help you, our on-site teams, grow to be the best operator, the best property manager, the best maintenance supervisor, and increase your career and your opportunities, right? So looking at that feedback and having that growth mindset, not that punitive mindset, I think is also really important to keep that trust between our teams and the corporations as well. Such really great takeaways. And guys, Sara put together a download, a PDF download, the real reasons why residents leave. There's a bunch of fantastic takeaways and tidbits in there for you. One of the things I pointed out is she put a little friction audit in there, but there are several other tools and tips. So I recommend definitely downloading that PDF, taking a look at it. It's available on her consulting page, which is 6dotsconsulting.com/downloads. We'll be including it in the follow-up email as well. So you'll get a copy of that link. Our team just put it in the chat as well if you want to grab it from there. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today, Sara. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure. Such a timely topic. I know retention and renewals never go out of style. So really appreciate the time and everyone listening in today.
Yes. And guys, if you're not already following Sara on LinkedIn, please scan that QR code. She posts some amazing content. She's not holding back. She's sharing it all. She's saying it like it is. I've been in the industry almost 30 years now, and I learn things every time I read her posts. So definitely someone to be following. So scan that QR code, follow Sara. This time around, we're doing our conversation. We're going to keep that conversation going on LinkedIn. So I want you to go to LinkedIn, look for that post for the real reason why residents leave. Let us know what you think about some of the takeaways that Sara shared with us today. What really resonated with you? How are you going to implement that in your operations? We're going to be looking at all those comments, and today by 5 p.m. Pacific time, we're going to go ahead and award our favorite comment with a little gift. And guys, if you are familiar with Satisfax, you know that every other year since 2011, we've been doing a biannual online resident survey, the online renter study. And this study has really been, for me, a guide on how renters use reviews, experience, feedback, decision-making, technology, what they want, what they value, what they don't want. And we're doing it again in June. So if you would like to be a part of that benchmark, please scan that QR code and you can participate. We'll survey your residents and give you your own data set so that you can see how your residents feel about those topics. Now, in May, we will not be back with a Ready, Set, Respond because I'm going to be traveling quite a bit. I'm going to be at the AIM conference, the TAA1 conference, speaking at the DAA meeting and the MAA meeting. So please forgive me, but we will be back in June with another Ready, Set, Respond. So keep your eyes open for your email to register. And thank you for joining us for today's conversation on the Real Reason Residents Leave with Sara. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.